This morning we're going to take a look at that question. What is life all about? And we're going to look at somebody who had a pretty good life. King Solomon. When you think about it, if you would open up to 1 Kings, that's where we're going to start this morning, 1 Kings and chapter 2. When you think about Solomon's life, he had it pretty good. The first thing we notice about King Solomon is that he had a great job. 1 Kings chapter 2 is where we're going to be. Can you think about that? He was the anointed of God. The king over the children of Israel. The king over God's chosen people. That was his job. And when we look there in chapter 2 of 1 Kings, and we start there in verse 10, notice what it says. It says, "So David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. The period that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. 7 years he reigned in Hebron. In Jerusalem he reigned 33 years. Then Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingdom was firmly established." That's what every king wants. When they assume the throne, they want their kingdom to be firmly established. What does that mean? That means the borders are secure. They don't have to worry about being attacked by anybody. They don't have to worry about any enemies. That's what David had done with God's help for the kingdom of Israel. By the time of David's death, David had solidified the borders. They were set. Most people in the world feared the children of Israel because they understood that God was with them. The kingdom was firmly established. So when Solomon takes over the throne, it's a great gig. Because he doesn't have to do much. And then what's the other task that he's given as king? To build the temple for the living God. What better job can you have than to rule God's people in a kingdom that's established and then be told by God, you get to build my house. The very house where I will dwell on this earth. You get to build it. Solomon had a great job. But that wasn't all that he had. He was famous. And there are some people that'll tell you that life is all about trying to become famous. And in today's age with the internet, you can do that pretty easily for yourself. But for Solomon, he was famous also. Let's turn over to chapter 4 and verse 34. 1 Kings 4 and verse 34, notice it says, "And men of all nations from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom came to hear the wisdom of Solomon." He was famous. It says men of all nations that were in existence, came to hear Solomon, to hear his wisdom. And it said kings of all the earth came to hear his wisdom. That's fame. He was famous. We see the same thing mentioned in chapter 10 and verse 1. With the story that we all know about the Queen of Sheba. It says there, "Now when the Queen of Sheba, which was quite a ways south in Africa," it says, "when she had heard the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions." His fame had spread throughout the known world. His abilities. He was famous. And that's what some people live for. Some people live to be famous. Solomon had that. Solomon was also blessed with a great fortune. Stay there in chapter 10 and turn over to verse 14 now. Notice what it says. It says, "The weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. Besides that, from the traveling merchants, from the income of traders, from all the kings of Arabia, and from the governors of the country." Now it says there 666 talents of gold. How much is that? How much was a talent? And this is different than the New Testament talent. In the New Testament, a talent was a coin that they used. In the Old Testament, the talent was a measure of weight. 1 talent was 75 pounds. So now think about that. 666 talents. How many pounds is that? It's a lot. I did the math earlier. I can't remember now what it was. I didn't write it down. Because there's something more important. Because now if we convert that into the amount of money in today's dollars, today's US dollar, that Solomon was bringing in yearly just from what was given to him from this. Okay? With gold right now at $1,368 a troy ounce, 75 pounds times 666 talents, comes out to $995,771,786 that Solomon was getting in this manner every year. That's $1 billion. And we thought $1 billion was a new number. That's what Solomon got every year. It says yearly. the gold that came into him. And that's just the gold. That's not the silver, that's not the precious jewels, that's not the other things that he got. $1 billion worth of gold every year. He was rich. In fact, if you look over now in verse 23, notice what it says. It says, so King Solomon surpassed all the kings of the earth in riches and wisdom. He was the wealthiest man alive at the time. What more could you want? That's what a lot of people strive for today, isn't it? To become the wealthiest man alive. He had a great fortune. But we also see that he had a great education. Now, we don't know where he went to school. We don't know if he went to Harvard or Cambridge or some great school that exists today. We don't know where he went to school, but I guarantee you he had a great education. Let's look at back chapter 3 of 1 Kings. And verse 5 is where God comes to Solomon in a dream and he says, ask. Whatever you ask, I'm going to give to you. What shall I give you? Is the question that he poses to Solomon. Verse 7, we see Solomon's answer. Solomon says, now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king instead of my father David, but I am a little child. I do not know how to go out or to come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? So Solomon, when given the choice to ask for anything that he wanted, he asked for wisdom. He asked for an understanding heart. God is so pleased with this. In verse 11 he says, then God said to him, because you have asked this thing, and have not asked for long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you. Solomon had the best education you could ever get. He had an education straight from God. God granted him all the wisdom that he would ever need in order to rule the people of Israel, which was the greatest thing that he could have. That would make his job much easier, being able to discern justice. But it was even more than that. If we go over to chapter 4, and we look at verse 29. Notice what it says. It says, and God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart, like the sand on the seashore. How many of you can number the sand of the seashore? It's impossible. I shouldn't say impossible, because with God anything is possible. But it is very difficult to do. And he says here that that's how great of wisdom and largeness of heart. Largeness of heart means compassion and understanding and empathy that he gave him. And in verse 32, it says, he spoke, this is Solomon spoke, 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Wouldn't it be nice if we had all 3,000 of his proverbs written down? The wealth of information that was there. Solomon had it all. He had everything that anybody could ever want. He had a great job. He was famous. He had more money than we can ever imagine. And he had a great education straight from God that was going to help him to do everything that he needed to do in his life. But you know what? When you read about Solomon, he knew something was missing. He could tell that this was not what life was all about. And so this morning, we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the case that he makes in the book of Ecclesiastes. Because that book is where Solomon sits down and he says, all right, I've had it all. Now let me tell you what it's really about. And a lot of times we focus on the last end of that, very end of that, not the last verse, but the next to last verse. In the book of Ecclesiastes, you say, well, that's all we need to know. It's not. Because if you read the rest of that, you find out there was a lot more to what Solomon had to say than just what we need to do. So if you would, open up this book of Ecclesiastes. We're going to be there the rest of the morning. We're going to start in chapter 1 and verse 13, because here is where Solomon sets out his goal. He says, this is what I'm going to do. Verse 13 of chapter 1, it says, and I set my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. Right there he says, I'm going to figure out what's the purpose, is what he's saying. What is life all about? That's what he wanted to know. What is life all about? I'm going to search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. What is life all about? Is the question that he wanted to ask. He wanted to find that answer. And it's interesting then as you read the rest of this book and you find out what he has to say about those things that we just talked about work, about riches, about education, about pleasure. He makes some interesting conclusions about those things, and that's what we're going to spend the majority of our time on this morning. And I want to begin by looking at work, because work is extremely important. We have to work in order to make money to support ourselves, right? It's the way life is. And Solomon doesn't go through and say, well, work is, something that you shouldn't do, because we understand that God tells us that we have to work. If we're not willing to provide for our families, then we're worse than unbelievers, we're told in the New Testament. But what does Solomon have to say about that? First of all, we find out that he says that it's rather futile. Chapter 1 there, back in verse 3 and verse 4, it says, what profit has a man from all his labor, in which he toils under the sun? So there's the question. What good is it to work? Look at the answer in verse 4. He says, one generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. He says it's kind of futile. Because you work all of your life to accomplish those things in your work that you want to accomplish, and then you pass on, and guess what happens? Somebody else steps into that job, and the job continues on. And when they die, somebody else steps in, and it continues on. He says it's kind of futile. Because everything that you do in your entire life, when you're at work and you're working so hard to accomplish those things, in the whole scheme of things, it really doesn't matter much. Is the point that he comes across. And he continues on in chapter 2. We're going to start there in verse 17. And he says, therefore I hated life, because the work that was done under the sun was distressing to me. For all is vanity and grasping for the wind. He says, I hated life because of the work. Because work was all that was going on, was all that was being done. And he says it's vanity. It's not a word we use very often anymore. But what is that? Vanity. Vanity means empty, useless. So what is he saying? He's saying that work was distressing and it was useless. It was empty. As a matter of fact, if you look at vanity in the dictionary, one of the definitions says the fact of being useless or futile. It's not just an opinion. It's a fact. And that's what Solomon says here. That work was vanity. It was useless. It was empty. Let's keep reading then in verse 18. It says, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. So he goes on to explain, why is it all empty? Because everything that I work for, when I die, it goes on to somebody else. And he says, I don't know if that guy's going to be smart or stupid, but he's going to get it, and he may squander it all by the time that he gets it. And he comes to the conclusion then, as a result of that, it's kind of worthless. It's useless. It's empty. His point is, it's empty and useless to spend your entire life so focused on work that you do nothing else. And there are people like that in the world. But that's what they make of their focus in life, is just to work. And here Solomon is trying to explain to them that it's empty, it's vain, it's useless. Because he tells us the result down there in verse 22 and 23. 22, he asks the question, for what has man for all his labor, and for the striving in his heart with which he has toiled under the sun? The question he's asking, what is the result of making work the entire focus of your life? That's the question he's asking. Here's the answer. Verse 23, for all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This also is vanity. So the conclusion that the wisest man that's ever lived, and he's not book wise, he's God wise, the conclusion that he comes to is that spending all your life working, and just working, is like trying to grab the wind. Anybody do that? The wind was blowing really hard last night, and I thought about that. And I heard that, and I'm thinking about this phrase, grasping the wind. You can't do it. No matter how hard you try, you cannot grab hold of it. It always slips through your fingers. That's how useless Solomon is saying that just focusing on work your entire life is. It's useless. It doesn't accomplish anything, because everything that you gain from doing that, you pass on to somebody else, and who knows how they're going to handle it. point that he makes. So the conclusion that he makes about work is that it's vanity, it's empty, it's useless to spend our entire lives focusing on that. But he also talks about riches, and this is coming from a guy that was bringing in $1 billion a year. Can't imagine that. That's every year, and he reigned for a long time. So just think about the amount of riches that he amassed during that time period. And for some people, riches is what's important to them. But notice what he says in chapter 5, beginning there in verse 10. This is going to tie in very well with what the comment Jim made in class today. I thought he was going to steal my sermon from me. Notice what it says. Chapter 5 and verse 10, it says, "He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity." And that's a statement that we all know to be true. People that have a lot of money, what do they want? They're not satisfied, they want more. People that don't have a lot of money, when they get some money, what do they? They want more money. That's what he's telling us here. Verse 11, "When goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes?" He's saying all of those riches that you can amass here. You amass riches, more people want to come along and take some. Is that true? Yeah. Talk to anybody that's ever won the lottery. People come out of the woodwork saying, "Hey, I think I'm related to you. You want to give me some money?" Or, "Hey, you remember we were friends back in high school. You want to give me some money?" That's what he's saying right here. He says, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. People come from everywhere to try and get a piece of it. Then he says, "So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes?" The only good that it does them is to see it. It doesn't do them any good. Let's keep reading. Verse 12, "The sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much. But the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep." Because they're so worried about making more money or losing the money that they've got, that they lose sleep over it. Verse 13, "There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun, riches kept for their owner to his hurt. But those riches perish through misfortune." Look at that. Notice what he's saying about riches. They're not satisfying. And he's saying that if you're not careful, they're going to disappear before you even know it. Because they bring more problems many times than they're worth. And in chapter 6 and verse 2, he alludes to the fact that they can disappear very rapidly when it comes to riches. He says, "A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that he lacks nothing for himself of all he desires, yet God does not give him power to eat of it, but a foreigner consumes it." He says right there, that's what happens. You may gain all of these things. They may be a blessing from God that you received all these things, but you have to be careful because they can disappear in a hurry. Somebody can come in and steal it from you. You can squander it on all kinds of things. Think about the prodigal son. He took his inheritance and he squandered it on riotous living, it says. It says riches are not satisfying. And so those that live their life just to gain riches, they're never going to be satisfied. It's never going to be enough for them. Let's notice another thing that Solomon talks about. He talks about pleasure. And here we're going to go back to chapter 2 and verse 3. And some people live their lives for this. That's all they're only about having fun. They don't care about working. They don't care about family. They don't care about anything else. All they want to do is have fun. Whatever makes me feel good, that's what I'm going to do. It doesn't matter whether it's good for me or not. But there are those people that are so focused on pleasure. And now, notice what Solomon has to say, because he had all the money in the world. He could have anything that he wanted. We're going to start back in chapter 2 and verse 3. It says, "I searched in my heart how to gratify my flesh." That's all about pleasure. He says, "With wine, how to gratify my flesh with wine, while guiding my heart with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, till I might see what was good for the sons of men to do under heaven all the days of their lives." So now he's going to try this other thing. Instead of the work thing, that didn't come out so well, because work's not good. He said, now I'm just going to devote myself to pleasure. All I'm going to worry about is pleasuring myself, providing myself with anything and everything that I want, and let's see how that comes about in satisfying me. So verse 4, he says, "I made my works great. I built myself houses, and I planted myself vineyards. I made myself gardens and orchards, and I planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made myself water pools from which to water the growing trees of the grove. I acquired male and female servants. I had servants born in my house. Yes, I had greater possessions of herds and flocks than all who were in Jerusalem before me. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the special treasures of kings and of the provinces. I acquired male and female singers, the delights of the sons of men, and musical instruments of all kinds. So I became great and excelled more than all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me." He didn't deny himself any pleasure of life. He got anything that he wanted. If he saw something he wanted, he just went out and bought it. He had those there right there to entertain him. He says male and female singers to entertain him. Whenever he felt like being entertained, everything was right there that he needed. He built gardens to spend time in. Everything was right there. He did not deny himself any pleasure. That's what it tells us in verse 10. Notice what it says. It says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. Anything he wanted, he just went out and got. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart rejoiced in all my labor, and this was my reward from all my labor. So he's trying to reward himself. He's like, I've gained all these things, so I'm not going to deny myself anything. Well, what was the result? Let's look at verse 11 there. He said it had no profit. Verse 11, it says, then I looked on all the works that my hands had done and on the labor in which I had toiled. He's talking about gathering all these pleasurable things. He said, indeed, all was vanity and grasping for the wind. There was no profit under the sun. He said, even when I had rewarded myself with everything that I had in life, I came out with the same answer. It was empty. It was vain. It was useless. He said there was no profit in it. So it's not painting a very good picture, is it? We can't focus on work. We can't focus on riches. We can't focus on pleasure. Well, maybe we can focus on learning. Solomon had a great education directly from God. And some people put their faith in learning even today. In fact, in chapter 2, verse 12, it tells us, this is one of the things that Solomon turned his mind to next. It says, then I turned myself to consider wisdom and madness and folly. So that's what he focused on next. After work didn't satisfy the way it was supposed to. After pleasure didn't satisfy the way it was supposed to. After riches didn't satisfy. He's like, now I'm going to look at wisdom. Maybe learning, maybe education is what really satisfies. And so in verse 12, that's what he turns to. He turns to wisdom. And he came up with some ideas. There in verse 13, notice what he says. He says, being wise is better than being stupid. He says, then I saw that wisdom excels folly. So he says, being smart is better than being foolish. By how much? He says, well, as light excels darkness. So however much light is better than dark, which according to God, we want to be in the light and not in the darkness, right? So there's an immense distance between the two. So Solomon found out that it's much better to be wise than it is to be foolish. I would agree with that. Makes life a lot easier when you're wise than when you're foolish. But he kept going on. Because one thing he found out is that whether you're wise or foolish, we all have the same fate. Verse 14, it says, the wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. Yet I myself perceive that the same event happens to them all. What is that? Well, he's going to tell us. So I said in my heart, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. And why was I then more wise? Then I said to my heart, this also is vanity. For there is no more remembrance of the wise than of the fool forever. Since all that now is will be forgotten in the days to come. And how does a wise man die? Same as the fool. So he figured out that being wise was better than being foolish. But then he figured out that, in the end, it doesn't really matter. Because being wise, for the most part, is not going to make me live any longer than being a fool. I'm sure we can all name lots of foolish people who lived to a good old age. A lot of wise people that died a lot younger. He says it doesn't matter. Whether I'm wise or I'm foolish, it doesn't matter. We're still all going to die. And so he comes to the conclusion then. There in verse 15 he says, this also is vanity. So wisdom also is useless and empty. When that's the sole focus of your life. In chapter 8, verse 16 and 17 there, he tells us why seeking after wisdom is so futile. Verse 16, it says, when I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. He says seeking after wisdom as the sole purpose in your life is so useless because you can never attain it. You can never attain all of it. He says it's impossible to completely figure it all out. So he says it's useless. It's empty to make that the focus of your life. So what conclusion does he come down to? What was the result of making work or riches or pleasure or education the sole focus of your life? What does he say? Let's go to chapter 6. We're going to begin there in verse 7. He says, all of the labor of man is for his mouth. That's work. And yet the soul is not satisfied. For what more has the wise man than the fool? There's education. What does the poor man have, who knows how to walk before the living? That's a reference to riches. Better is the sight of the eyes than the wandering of desire. There's pleasure. It says this also is vanity and grasping for the wind. In the end, after he looked at work and after he looked at education and riches and desire and pleasures, he said, if those are the focuses of your life, he says it's all empty. It's all vain. And he makes that conclusion as we get to the last chapter in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 12 and verse 8. He says, vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity. All of those things, if you make that the focus of your life, he says, it's empty, it's useless, it's grasping for the wind. You'll never catch it no matter how hard you try. But he didn't leave it at that. That's not where he left it. He didn't say, well, it's just useless. So don't work and don't worry about money and don't worry about learning the stuff and don't worry about pleasure. He didn't say that. He said, if those are your focus, then your focus is in the wrong place. But he does offer us some hope. He tells us that when it comes to work, we have to have more than just that in life. And actually, when it comes to all of these things, we have to have more than just that. And I want to look at the scripture in chapter 3 and verse 12 there. But this same idea is mentioned in those other places and several other places in the book of Ecclesiastes. I didn't put them all down. But in chapter 3 and verse 12, notice what he says. He says, I know that nothing is better for them, that's for man, than to rejoice and to do good in their lives. And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. So after he considers all this, what does he come up with? He says, you know what? Pursue those things in little pieces and make sure you set aside time to enjoy it. Set aside time to enjoy the things that God has blessed you with. He says that's the key here. Don't make those things your focus. He says you can do them a little bit. You have to do them a little bit. He says when it comes right down to it, set aside time to enjoy those things that you've earned. Because he says it's the gift of God. It's something that God has given us, that God wants us to. God wants us to enjoy this life. He doesn't want us to be miserable because all we do is work or all we do is focus on these other things that keep us away from Him. He said enjoy those things that He's given us. And he adds to that back in chapter 2, verse 26. He says, for God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. So there we go. Do what is good. Do those things that God wants us to do. And he said He's going to give us wisdom and knowledge and joy. And that ties in now to chapter 12, which is the chapter we always go to when we talk about Ecclesiastes. We don't focus on much else in the book of Ecclesiastes. But he tells us in the end where true happiness is found. In verse 13 where he says, fear God and keep His commandments. For this is the whole duty of man. It's the old King James way of saying it. I like that because it makes it sound like that's our job in this life, is to fear God and keep His commandments. And so what Solomon does is Solomon has looked at all of these things in life. He's trying to find out exactly what life was all about. And his conclusion at the end is fear God and keep His commandments. Because if you do that, then you'll have the proper balance in life. Because if I'm fearing God and I'm keeping His commandments, am I going to work? Yes, I am, because I'm supposed to support my family. And if I'm working, am I going to have the money that I need to provide for my family? I am. And if I can't, God says He's going to take care of me, Matthew chapter 6. Because He has mechanisms set up for that. Am I going to find pleasure in this life? If I fear God and keep His commandments, I most certainly am. Probably more pleasure than those that just seek after pleasure. Because the pleasures that I'll find as a servant of God are lasting. They're not fleeting like the pleasures of this life. And am I going to be wise if I fear God and keep His commandments. I most certainly am, because I'm going to have all of those things. All of this word I'm going to be putting in my head and my heart. It's going to make life so much better. But as God always does, He doesn't just tell us that and just leave it and say, well, there's what you got to do. He tells us why. If you look at verse 14, He tells us why. Why are we supposed to fear God and keep His commandments? Here it is. Because right there where it says for means it's why. It says, for God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. That's why. That's why we're supposed to fear God and keep His commandments. Because God's going to judge our lives later on. And He's going to say, did you do the right thing or did you do the wrong thing? Did you make work the focus of your life or did you make God the focus of your life? Were you just after pleasures or were you after God? That's the question that He's going to ask when we get to judgment. So that's the question I have for you today. What's important to you? And I got to thinking about this because of one question that kept coming up. If I went to the people that I worked with or the people that I associated with outside of this group, and somebody asked them, what's important to Jarrod? What were they going to say? Were they going to say, I can tell by the way he lives his life that God is important to him. God is the most important thing. Or would they say work is? Or would they say money is? Now I want you to turn that on yourself. If I went to the places that you work and the people that you spend a lot of time with and I said, what's most important to him? What's most important to her? Are they going to look at your life and say, God is most important? That's what God wants from us. He wants to be in the number one spot in our life. I think for a lot of us, that wouldn't be the answer. I know for a long time in my life, that wouldn't have been the answer that someone would have given. I don't even know if it would be now. I've made a lot of changes to try and get to that point, so if somebody asks, I'll say, yep, God's number one. I don't know if I'm there yet. I want you to think about that over the next week. Make those changes. Make God your focus, because I guarantee if you make God your focus, all those other things are going to fall in place. Because He promises that. He says, if you put me first, Matthew 6:33, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, all those things, all the physical things of life, He's going to give you. Do you believe that? Do you have faith in that? If you do, you put God first and it won't matter. So this morning we offer the invitation. If you need to make things right in your life, or if you need to be baptized for the first time, to say, yes, God's number one in my life, then we give you that opportunity now as we stand and sing.
Why do you wait, dear brother?